Shunkin Sho, A Portrait of Shunkin. By Junichiro Tanizaki. Shunkin, whose real name was Koto Mozuya, was born into a family of pharmacists in Dosamachi, Osaka. She died on October 14, 1886, and her grave is at a certain Jodoshu temple in the Shimotera district of the city. The other day, feeling a sudden urge to pay my respects, I stopped by the temple and asked for directions. "The Mozuya family graves are this way," said the temple attendant, leading me around behind the main hall. There, in the shade of a cluster of camellia trees, were several generations of Mozuya family graves, but none that seemed to belong to Shunkin. I mentioned that there had once been a daughter of the Mozuya family who was quite renowned. After thinking for a while, he said, "If that's the one you're looking for, it might be that one over there," and led me up a steep, stepped path on the east side. As you know, the eastern side of Shimotera backs onto the heights where the Ikukunitama shrine stands. The steep path led up the slope from the temple grounds to this elevated area. It's an unusually wooded spot for Osaka, and Shunkin's grave stood on a small, level clearing halfway up the slope. The gravestone bore the posthumous Buddhist name, Koi Shunkin Ish Zenjini. On the back, it read, secular name, Koto Mozuya, art name, Shunkin. Died October 14, 1886, aged 58 years. And on the side, erected by her disciple, Sasuke Nukui. Although Shunkin went by the name Mozuya throughout her life, she lived as the de facto wife of the blind musician, Kenji Nukui. Perhaps this is why she chose a separate plot, away from the Mozuya family graveyard. The temple attendant told me that the Mozuya family had long since fallen into ruin and only rarely did members of the clan come to visit the graves, and almost never Shunkin's. So he had never imagined that this was the grave of one of their kin. I asked if the grave was then neglected, and he replied, "No, not at all." An elderly woman of about 70, living in the Hagai tea house, comes to pay her respects once or twice a year. She visits this grave, then, he pointed to another grave to the left of Shunkin's, she always offers incense at this smaller one as well. He added that she also paid for the memorial services. I went to look at the small grave he'd indicated. The stone was about half the size of Shunkin's. It was inscribed with the posthumous name, Shinio Kindai Shd Shinsha. On the back, secular name, Sasuke Nukui, art name, Kindai, disciple of Shunkin Mozuya. Died October 14, 1907, aged 83 years. This was Kenji Nukui's grave. I'll speak later of the old woman of the Hagai tea house. For now, note that Nukui's grave is smaller than Shunkin's, and that it's inscribed with his status as her disciple, maintaining the decorum of their relationship even in death, a testament to his devotion. I stood on that hill, the setting sun shining brightly on the gravestones, and gazed at the vast panorama of Osaka spread out below. This area has been hilly since the ancient days of Naniwa Bay, the westward-facing slopes extending from here all the way to Tennoji. Now, the leaves of the trees and grasses are dulled by soot, and dead trees stand withered and dust-covered, lending the scene a desolate air. But when these graves were erected, the area must have been more densely forested. Even now, this is perhaps the most tranquil and scenic of the city's cemeteries. Bound by a strange fate, these two, teacher and disciple, lie here for eternity, looking down upon the numberless skyscrapers of this greatest industrial city of the Orient. Today's Osaka has changed beyond recognition from the days when Nukui lived, but these two gravestones seem to still speak of the deep bond between teacher and disciple. Nukui's family were originally followers of the Nichiren sect of Buddhism, and the graves of his family, excluding Nukui himself, are at a certain temple in Hino, Mie Province, his birthplace. He abandoned his ancestral faith and converted to the Jodoshu sect so that he could be by Shunkin's side even in death. It is said that during Shunkin's lifetime, their posthumous Buddhist names, the position and relative sizes of their gravestones, had already been decided. Judging by eye, Shunkin's gravestone is about 6 feet tall, while Nukui's is less than 4. They stand side by side on a low stone platform. To the right of Shunkin's grave, a pine tree has been planted. Its green branches extend over the gravestone like a roof. A few feet away to the left, where the pine branches don't reach, Nukui's gravestone stands as if bowing respectfully in attendance. It brings to mind the image of Nukui in life, diligently serving his teacher, always by her side. It's as though the stones themselves possess spirits, and still revel in that happiness today. I knelt before Shunkin's grave and bowed respectfully, then placed my hand on Nukui's gravestone, caressing it as I lingered on the hill until the sun set over the vast city. Among my recent acquisitions is a small booklet titled The Life of Shunkin Mozuya, which was my introduction to her. It's a modest work of around 30 pages, printed in small type on handmade Japanese paper. I suspect it was commissioned by Nukui for distribution as a memorial to his teacher on the 3rd anniversary of her death. Although the text is written in the third person, the material was undoubtedly provided by Nukui himself, and it's safe to assume that he was the true author. The biography states that the Mozuya family, for generations known as Yasuzeman Mozuya, resided in Dosamachi, Osaka, where they ran a pharmacy. Shunkin's father was the 7th generation. Her mother, Shige, was the daughter of the Atobe family of Fuyacho, Kyoto. She married Yasuzeman and bore him 2 sons and 4 daughters. Shunkin, the second daughter, was born on May 24, 1827. It goes on to say, from a young age, Shunkin was remarkably intelligent. Moreover, her beauty and refinement were beyond compare. At the age of 4, she began dance lessons. Her every movement and gesture was so naturally graceful and elegant, surpassing even professional dancers, that her teacher would often marvel, alas, this child, with such talent and bearing, is destined for fame. Yet, to be born into a good family, is it a blessing or a curse? She also excelled rapidly in reading and writing, surpassing even her 2 older brothers. Given that these accounts likely originated from Nukui, who practically worshipped Shunkin, their complete accuracy is uncertain. However, various other sources confirm that she was indeed born with exceptional beauty and refinement. Women were generally shorter in those days, and Shunkin herself was less than 5 feet tall. Her face and limbs were delicately formed and exquisitely refined. A photograph of Shunkin at the age of 37 survives. It shows an oval face with delicate features, as if each had been carefully sculpted. Since it was taken in the early Meiji or late Kyo era, the image is faded and dotted with blemishes, like a distant memory. This blurring perhaps contributes to the overall impression. While it reveals the elegance befitting a woman from a wealthy Osaka merchant family, it lacks a striking individuality, conveying a rather faint impression. She looks 37, yet could also pass for 27 or 28. By this time, Shunkin had already been blind for over 20 years, but rather than appearing blind, she looks as if she's simply closing her eyes. The writer Soto Haruo once remarked that deaf people appear foolish, while blind people appear wise. This is because deaf people, in their efforts to hear, often furrow their brows, open their eyes and mouths wide, and tilt or crane their necks, giving them a somewhat vacant air. Blind people, on the other hand, often sit quietly with their heads bowed, as if in deep meditation, thus appearing thoughtful. Whether this observation holds true generally is debatable, but it might be related to the image of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, whose eyes of compassion are half closed. Perhaps, accustomed to this image, we associate closed eyes with compassion and grace, and sometimes even awe, more readily than open eyes. In Shunkin's closed eyelids, especially given her gentle nature, one senses a subtle compassion, like that evoked by gazing at an ancient image of Kannon, the Bodhisattva of mercy. I'm told that this is the only existing photograph of Shunkin. Photography had not yet been introduced to Japan during her childhood, and in the same year this photograph was taken, a certain misfortune befell her. Afterward, she apparently refused to be photographed again. Thus, we have only this one faded image to conjure her appearance. Having read my description, the reader will likely have formed a rather vague and unsatisfactory mental image. However, even seeing the actual photograph would probably not offer much further clarity. In fact, the photograph itself might be even more indistinct than the reader's imagined picture. It's worth noting that in the year this photograph was taken, when Shunkin was 37, Nukui also lost his sight. It's possible that this blurry image is close to the last sight of her that he had. Perhaps this is how she remained in his memory in his later years. Or perhaps, as his memories faded, he filled the gaps with his imagination, creating a different, idealized image of a noble woman, entirely unlike the photograph. the biography continues, Shunkin's parents cherished her like a jewel in their palm, favoring her above her 5 siblings. However, when she was 9, she tragically contracted an eye disease and soon lost her sight completely. Her parents' grief was immeasurable. Her mother, lamenting her child's misfortune, cursed heaven and earth, and for a time, seemed to lose her mind. Shunkin, abandoning her dance aspirations, devoted herself to the koto and shamisen, embarking on the path of music. The exact nature of Shunkin's eye disease is unclear, and the biography provides no further details. However, Nukui later confided in someone, saying, as the saying goes, "Tall trees are envied by the wind." My teacher, with her beauty and talent, was twice targeted by the jealousy of others. Her misfortune was entirely due to these 2 calamities. This suggests that there might be more to the story. Nukui also said that Shunkin suffered from ophthalmia. Although Shunkin, having been raised in luxury, could be arrogant, she was also charming, compassionate to those beneath her, and possessed a cheerful and vivacious nature. She was popular, got along well with her siblings, and was loved by everyone in the household. However, it's said that the wet nurse who attended her youngest sister resented the parents' favoritism and secretly harbored ill will toward Shunkin. As is well known, ophthalmia can be caused by the bacteria that also cause venereal disease infecting the mucous membranes of the eye. Perhaps Nukui was hinting that the wet nurse had somehow intentionally infected Shunkin, causing her blindness. However, whether this was based on any concrete evidence or merely Nukui's conjecture is unclear. Considering Shunkin's later fiery temperament, it's tempting to speculate that such an incident might have influenced her personality. However, a pattern emerges in Nukui's accounts. In his grief over Shunkin's misfortunes, he tends to blame and curse others, a tendency that makes it difficult to accept everything he says at face value. The story about the wet nurse is likely nothing more than speculation. For our purposes, it's enough to note that Shunkin became blind at the age of 9. And that, abandoning her dance aspirations, she devoted herself to the koto and shamisen, embarking on the path of music. This implies that Shunkin turned to music as a result of losing her sight. She herself apparently often told Nukui that her true talent lay in dance, and that people praised her music only because they didn't know what she was truly capable of. She insisted that if she had not lost her sight, she would never have pursued music. This could be interpreted as boasting, revealing her arrogance. However, it's also possible that Nukui embellished her words. Perhaps she uttered them in a moment of frustration, and he, cherishing every word she spoke, imbued them with undue significance to enhance her image. The elderly woman living in the Hagai tea house, whom I mentioned earlier, is named Toru Shigesawa. She was a koto teacher of the Akuta school, and served Shunkin and Nukui in their later years. According to Toru, my teacher, Shunkin, was apparently very skilled at dance, but she also began learning the koto and shamisen from the age of 5 or 6, under the tutelage of a blind musician named Haramatsu. She continued her musical training diligently. Therefore, it's not true that she started learning music only after losing her sight. It was customary for young ladies from good families to take lessons in the arts. It's said that at the age of 10, my teacher mastered the difficult piece Zangetsu by ear, playing it on the shamisen unaccompanied. This demonstrates her innate musical talent, a feat beyond the reach of ordinary people. However, after losing her sight, with fewer other pleasures available to her, she immersed herself even more deeply in music, dedicating her heart and soul to it. This account seems more credible. It's likely that Shunkin's true talent lay in music from the beginning, and her skill in dance remains questionable. The biography states that, by the age of 15, Shunkin's skills had greatly advanced, surpassing all her peers. There was no one among her fellow students who could match her. This is likely true, given her dedication. Toru Shigesawa recalls, "My teacher used to boast that although Kenji Haramatsu was a very strict teacher, she was never scolded. She was more often praised. When I went to her, my teacher always taught me herself, very kindly and patiently. I couldn't understand why other students were afraid of her. It must have been her natural talent that allowed her to achieve so much without experiencing the usual hardships of training." As the daughter of a wealthy family, Shunkin would not have been subjected to the same harsh treatment as children of musicians. Her teacher likely showed some leniency. He may have also felt protective of this talented young girl who had tragically lost her sight. Above all, however, he admired and cherished her talent. He cared for Shunkin even more than his own children. If she missed a lesson due to even a slight illness, he would immediately send a messenger to the Mozuya house in Dosamachi, or even visit her himself. He always boasted of having Shunkin as his student, and would often tell his other students, "You should all learn from Miss Mozuya." Note: in Osaka, Ojo-san, young lady, is also called Ito-san or Ta-san, and a younger daughter is sometimes referred to as Koito-san or Koi-san in relation to her older sister. Haramatsu likely used this term because he had also taught Shunkin's older sister and was on familiar terms with the family. Those of you who will have to make a living with your skills alone should be ashamed if you can't even keep up with an amateur like her. When criticized for being too lenient with Shunkin, he retorted, "What are you talking about? A good teacher is strict with their students. The reason I don't scold her is simply because I don't need to. She has a natural aptitude for music and learns quickly. She'll progress on her own. If I were to push her too hard, she would become truly formidable, and my professional students would be in trouble. There's no need to train a girl from a good family, who has no need to earn a living, to such an extent. I'm putting all my effort into those with less talent, to make them into accomplished musicians. How can you misunderstand my intentions so completely?" Kenji Haramatsu lived in Utubo, about a mile from the Mozuya pharmacy in Dosamachi. Shunkin went there for lessons every day, led by an apprentice boy named Sasuke, who would later become Kenji Nukui. This is how their relationship began. As mentioned earlier, Sasuke was from Hino, Mie Province. His family also ran a pharmacy, and both his father and grandfather had apprenticed at the Mozuya pharmacy in Osaka. The Mozuyas were, in fact, Sasuke's hereditary employers. Sasuke, 4 years older than Shunkin, began his apprenticeship at the age of 13. This was the same year that Shunkin, at the age of 9, lost her sight. Nukui later said that he never regretted not seeing Shunkin's eyes before she became blind. He considered it a blessing. If he had known her before, he might have perceived her face as incomplete after she lost her sight. But fortunately, he never felt that her face lacked anything. From the beginning, it appeared to him perfect and complete. Nowadays, wealthy families in Osaka are moving their residences to the suburbs, and their daughters are taking up sports, enjoying the fresh air and sunlight. The image of the cloistered beauty, the sheltered young lady, has vanished. But even now, children raised in the city tend to be more delicate, with pale complexions, different from the robust, sun-kissed skin of children raised in the countryside. This isn't unique to Osaka, it's a characteristic of all cities. In Edo, however, even women boasted of their dark skin, and fair complexions were not as prized as in Kyoto and Osaka. Among the old families of Osaka, even men were often slender and delicate, like the young dandies depicted in plays. It wasn't until they reached their 30s that their faces would tan, they'd gain weight, and acquire a more masculine presence. Until then, they, like women, tended to be fair-skinned and favored delicate clothing. Imagine, then, the translucent whiteness, the delicate pallor, the slender frame of a young lady raised in the depths of a wealthy merchant's house in the old days, confined to dimly lit rooms, rarely venturing outside. How exotic and alluring she must have appeared to the country boy Sasuke. At that time, Shunkin's older sister was 12, and her younger sister 6. To the newly arrived Sasuke, they both seemed extraordinarily beautiful, unlike any girls he had seen in his village. But he was particularly captivated by the mysterious aura of the blind Shunkin. Shunkin's closed eyelids seemed brighter and more beautiful than the open eyes of her sisters. He felt that her face should be exactly as it was, that this was its natural state. Shunkin was reputed to be the most beautiful of the 4 sisters. While this might have been partly due to pity for her disability, Sasuke felt no such pity. He later vehemently denied that his love for Shunkin stemmed from sympathy or compassion. He would say, "I never once felt sorry for my teacher when I saw her face. Compared to my teacher, those who can see are the pitiful ones. Why would my teacher, with her spirit and beauty, seek anyone's pity? She would pity me, saying, 'Sasuke-don, you're the pitiful one. We, with our complete set of eyes, ears, and noses, are inferior to my teacher in every other way. We are the incomplete ones. Of course, this was much later. At first, Sasuke simply served her diligently, harboring a burning adoration deep within his heart. He was probably not yet aware of his love, and even if he was, she was the untouchable Koi-san, the young lady of his hereditary employers. Simply being assigned the task of accompanying her, walking with her every day, was probably enough consolation. It might seem strange that a newly arrived apprentice boy was entrusted with guiding the precious young lady, but initially, Sasuke wasn't the only one. Sometimes a maid would accompany her, sometimes another errand boy, sometimes a young priest. It varied. Then, one day, Shunkin said, "I want Sasuke-don," and from then on, at the age of 14, Sasuke became her permanent guide. He was deeply honored, and every day, he would enclose Shunkin's small hand in his own and lead her the mile to Haramatsu's house. He would wait there until her lesson finished and then guide her back. Shunkin rarely spoke during these walks, and Sasuke, for his part, remained silent unless she addressed him, focusing all his attention on avoiding any missteps. When someone asked Shunkin, "Why did you choose Sasuke-don?" she replied, "Because he's the quietest and doesn't say unnecessary things." As mentioned earlier, Shunkin was naturally charming and affable, but since losing her sight, she had become more withdrawn and sullen. She rarely laughed or spoke in a cheerful voice, and had become taciturn. Perhaps she preferred Sasuke's quiet attentiveness, his unobtrusive presence. Sasuke himself disliked seeing her smile. He felt that a blind person's smile looked vacant and pathetic, and he couldn't bear to see it. Whether Shunkin's true reason for choosing Sasuke was his quietness and unobtrusiveness is debatable. Perhaps, even at that young age, she sensed Sasuke's adoration and was pleased by it. This might seem unlikely for a 10-year-old girl, but considering her precociousness and heightened senses due to her blindness, it's not entirely implausible. Even later, when she became aware of her love, the proud Shunkin did not readily reveal her feelings and kept Sasuke at a distance for a long time. So, while there's some uncertainty, it seems that at first, Sasuke barely registered in Shunkin's consciousness, or so it seemed to him. When guiding her, Sasuke would hold his left hand at shoulder height, palm up, for Shunkin to place her right hand in. To Shunkin, Sasuke was little more than a guiding hand. When she needed something, she would gesture, frown, or mutter to herself enigmatically, never clearly expressing her wishes. If he failed to understand, she would invariably become displeased. Sasuke had to be constantly vigilant, observing her every expression and gesture, as if his attentiveness was constantly being tested. Her natural willfulness, combined with the stubbornness characteristic of the blind, gave Sasuke no respite. One day, at Haramatsu's house, while waiting for her turn for her lesson, Shunkin suddenly disappeared. Sasuke, alarmed, searched for her and found she had gone to the toilet unattended. Usually, when she needed to relieve herself, she would silently leave, and Sasuke, understanding her intention, would follow and guide her hand to the door, waiting outside to pour water for her to rinse her hands. But today, Sasuke had been momentarily distracted. "I'm so sorry," Sasuke said, his voice trembling, rushing to Shunkin as she reached for the dipper at the washbasin after leaving the toilet. "It's all right," she said, shaking her head. But in such situations, even if she said it was all right, it was never truly all right. He had to insist on assisting her, almost wresting the dipper from her hand to pour the water. Another time, on a hot summer afternoon, as he stood respectfully behind her while she waited for her lesson, she muttered, "It's hot." "Yes, it's very hot," Sasuke replied sympathetically. She didn't respond. A while later, she muttered again, "It's hot." Understanding, Sasuke took out his fan and began fanning her back. She seemed satisfied, but if his fanning faltered even slightly, she would immediately repeat, "It's hot." Shunkin's willfulness and capriciousness were undeniable, but they were particularly pronounced with Sasuke. She wasn't necessarily like this with everyone. It was partly due to her upbringing, but also because Sasuke always tried so hard to please her, anticipating her every whim, that she indulged in these behaviors with him more than anyone else. This explains why she found Sasuke so useful, and why Sasuke, rather than finding it burdensome, actually welcomed her particular brand of tyranny. He interpreted her capriciousness as a sign of favor, a kind of special attention. The room where Haramatsu taught his students was on a mezzanine floor at the back of the house. Sasuke would lead Shunkin up the stairs, place her koto or shamisen before her in the seat facing the teacher, and then retreat to the waiting room until the lesson was over. While waiting, he would listen intently, straining to hear when the lesson ended, so he could immediately go and escort her back without being summoned. Naturally, he became familiar with the music Shunkin was learning. This is how Sasuke's musical inclinations were nurtured. He later became a renowned musician in his own right, so he must have possessed some innate talent. But had he not had the opportunity to serve Shunkin, had he not been driven by his ardent desire to emulate her in every way, he would probably have inherited a branch of the Mozuya pharmacy and lived an ordinary life as a pharmacist. Even after he lost his sight and attained the rank of Kenji, he always maintained that his skills were far inferior to Shunkin's, attributing his success entirely to her inspiration. Considering Sasuke's tendency to elevate Shunkin to almost divine status and downplay his own abilities, his words should be taken with a grain of salt. But regardless of their relative skills, it's likely that Shunkin was more naturally gifted, while Sasuke was a diligent and hard-working student. He began secretly saving money to buy a shamisen at the end of his 14th year, squirreling away his small allowance and any tips he received. The following summer, he finally managed to purchase a cheap practice shamisen. To avoid being discovered by the head clerk, he smuggled it into his tiny attic room piece by piece, the neck, the body, and practiced late at night, waiting for his fellow apprentices to fall asleep. The attic was stiflingly hot in the summer, and the inside of the closet where he practiced must have been unbearable. But this allowed him to muffle the sound of the strings and block out any external noises like snoring or sleep-talking. Of course, he couldn't use a plectrum. He had to pluck the strings with his fingers, in complete darkness. But Sasuke didn't mind the darkness. He found it comforting to think that Shunkin also played the shamisen in this darkness, that he was sharing her experience. Even later, when he was allowed to practice openly, he retained the habit of closing his eyes while playing, saying that he wanted to do as Koi-san did. He seemed determined to share Shunkin's blindness, to experience the world as she did. He even seemed to envy her blindness. The fact that he later lost his sight is perhaps not so surprising, considering his long-held desire to emulate her. Mastering any musical instrument is a challenging endeavor. But the violin and the shamisen are particularly difficult, as they have no frets or markers to guide the fingers, and the strings must be tuned before each performance. It takes considerable effort to even become proficient enough to play simple tunes, and they are not instruments well suited for self-teaching, especially in an era without musical notation. It was commonly said that it took 3 months to learn the koto, but 3 years to learn the shamisen. Sasuke began with the shamisen, as he couldn't afford a koto, and such a large instrument would have been impossible to conceal. Remarkably, he was able to tune the instrument from the beginning. This indicates not only his innate musical ear, but also how attentively he had listened to others practicing while waiting for Shunkin at Haramatsu's house. He had to rely entirely on his oral memory for everything: the tuning, the lyrics, the melody, the phrasing. For about 6 months, from the summer of his 15th year, he managed to keep his practice sessions secret. But then, in the winter, an incident occurred. One early morning, around 4 o'clock in the winter, still the dead of night, Shige, Shunkin's mother, awoke to use the toilet and heard the faint strains of the shamisen piece Yuki, Snow, coming from somewhere. There was a custom of cold practice, where musicians would practice outdoors in the frigid pre-dawn hours as a form of training. But Dosamachi was a merchant district, a district of serious businesses, not a place where music teachers or performers lived. There were no pleasure houses there. Moreover, the hour was unusually late, even for cold practice. And the music was not the loud, vigorous playing one would expect from such a practice session, but a quiet plucking, as if someone was painstakingly practicing a difficult passage over and over. Shige, puzzled, didn't think much of it at the time and went back to sleep. But she heard it again several nights later, and other servants also began to notice it, whispering among themselves, "I heard it too. Where is it coming from? It doesn't sound like a tanuki drumming on its belly." While Sasuke had initially practiced in his closet, he had grown bolder, and the closet was so hot. He also suffered from constant sleep deprivation, trying to squeeze in practice time between his duties and his sleep. So, towards the end of autumn, He began sneaking out to the drying platform at night to practice. He would go to bed with the other apprentices at 10 o'clock, wake up around 3 in the morning, take his shamisen, and go out to the platform. There, in the cold night air, he would practice until dawn, then return to his bed. It was this practice that Shunkin's mother heard. The drying platform was likely on the roof of the storehouse, so the sound would have carried more easily to the inner house, across the courtyard, than to the rooms where the apprentices slept. Alerted by the servants in the inner house, the apprentices were questioned, and eventually, Sasuke's secret was discovered. He was summoned before the head clerk, severely reprimanded, and his shamisen confiscated, as was to be expected. However, unexpected help came from an unexpected source. Someone in the inner house expressed a desire to hear Sasuke play. And that someone was Shunkin. Sasuke had been worried that if Shunkin found out about his clandestine practice, she would be angry. He hadn't wanted to overstep his boundaries as an apprentice, and feared being punished or ridiculed. He was surprised when she asked to hear him play, suspecting it was a prank, a way to make fun of him. He also lacked the confidence to play in front of others. However, there was no refusing Shunkin, and her mother and sisters were also curious, so he was eventually summoned to the inner room to demonstrate the fruits of his secret practice. It was a momentous occasion for him. At the time, Sasuke had more or less mastered 5 or 6 pieces. He was told to play everything he knew, so he took a deep breath and played his heart out. He played simple pieces like Kurokami, Black Hair, difficult pieces like Cha Ondu, tea ceremony music, a mix of tunes he had picked up by ear, in no particular order. The Mozuya family might have initially intended to make fun of him, but they were impressed. They realized that for someone who had been self-teaching for such a short time, he had a good grasp of the music, and his phrasing was surprisingly accomplished. The biography states, Shunkin, taking pity on Sasuke's aspiration, said, "I commend your diligence. From now on, I shall teach you. Whenever you have free time, you may come to me as your teacher and practice diligently." Shunkin's father, Yasuzemon, finally consented, and Sasuke was overjoyed. He continued his duties as an apprentice, but also received instruction from Shunkin at set times each day. Thus, the 11-year-old girl and the 15-year-old boy, already bound as mistress and servant, now entered into a new bond as teacher and student. A joyous occasion indeed. Why did the capricious Shunkin suddenly show such kindness to Sasuke? Some say it wasn't her idea, but that others had suggested it. A blind girl, even in a loving family, is prone to loneliness and melancholy. Her parents, and even the servants, were constantly searching for ways to cheer her up and alleviate her boredom. They had likely been struggling with Shunkin's willfulness, and saw an opportunity to shift some of the burden onto Sasuke. They might have suggested, "What a remarkable young man Sasuke-don is. Why don't you take him under your wing, Koi-san? He'd be so grateful." However, Shunkin was not easily swayed by flattery, so it's unlikely she was simply manipulated. Perhaps she had genuinely come to like Sasuke, and a certain tenderness had begun to blossom in her heart. In any case, her offer to teach him was a relief to everyone in the household. No one expected much from an 11-year-old teacher, regardless of her talent. It was more about giving her something to occupy her time, a kind of playing school with Sasuke as her pupil. It was for Shunkin's benefit, rather than Sasuke's. But in the end, Sasuke was the one who benefited most. The biography says that Sasuke received instruction at set times each day while continuing his duties as an apprentice, but even before this, he spent several hours each day serving Shunkin. If he now had to go to her room for music lessons as well, there would have been little time left for his duties at the shop. Yasuzemon was likely concerned about Sasuke's future, feeling responsible for the boy entrusted to him by his parents in the countryside. He had been sent to Osaka to learn the pharmacy trade, not to become his daughter's companion. But Shunkin's happiness was paramount, and since Sasuke himself seemed eager, Yasuzemon tacitly approved the arrangement. It was from this time that Sasuke began calling Shunkin Oshisho-sama, teacher. Shunkin insisted he use this honorific during lessons, while at other times he could call her Koi-san. She, in turn, stopped calling him Sasuke-don and addressed him simply as Sasuke, mimicking the formal teacher-student dynamic of Haramatsu and his pupils. Thus, the playing school devised by the adults continued, providing Shunkin with a distraction from her loneliness. But within a few years, the game became increasingly serious for both teacher and student. Shunkin's routine was to go to Haramatsu's house in Utubo around 2 in the afternoon for a lesson lasting 30 minutes to an hour. She would then return home and practice what she had learned until evening. After dinner, when the mood struck her, she would summon Sasuke to her room on the second floor and give him a lesson. These lessons became a daily occurrence, sometimes lasting until 9 or 10 at night. The servants downstairs would often be startled by Shunkin's sharp voice scolding Sasuke, "Sasuke, did I teach you that? Or no, no, no. Keep playing until you get it right, even if it takes all night." Sometimes, this young teacher would lose her temper completely, shouting, "Idiot! Why can't you remember?" She would even hit him with her plectrum, and it wasn't uncommon for Sasuke to burst into tears. It was common practice in those days for music teachers to be extremely strict, often resorting to physical punishment. An article in the Osaka Asahi Shimbun on February 12 of this year, 1933, titled The Bloody Apprenticeship of Bunraku, described how the famous Bunraku chanter, the third Koshiji Dayu, had a crescent-shaped scar on his forehead, a memento from his teacher, Toyozawa Danshichi, who had knocked him to the ground with a plectrum, shouting, "When will you ever learn?" The Bunraku puppeteer Yoshida Tamajiro also had a similar scar on the back of his head. When Tamajiro was young, during a performance of Awaji no Naruto, his teacher, the renowned Yoshida Tamazao, was manipulating the puppet of Jurabei. Tamajiro was operating the puppet's legs, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't make the movements to Tamazao's satisfaction. "You idiot!" Tamazao shouted, and struck him on the head with the sword he was using in the performance. The scar remained visible for the rest of his life. Tamazao himself had once been struck on the head with a Jurabei puppet by his teacher, Kinsha, the puppet becoming stained with blood. Tamazao kept the broken puppet's leg wrapped in cotton in a wooden box, and would often take it out and venerate it as if it were a sacred relic, saying, "If it weren't for that puppet's beating, I might have remained a mediocre performer all my life." The previous generation's Sumi Dayu was considered slow and clumsy in his youth, earning him the nickname Naroma, Slowpoke. His teacher was the famous Toyozawa Danpei, known as Daidanpei, a giant of modern shamisen music. One sweltering summer night, Sumi was practicing the Mibumura section of Konoshita Koge Hazama Gassen at his teacher's house. He struggled with the line, "The amulet is a keepsake," and Danpei, listening from inside his mosquito net, refused to let him move on. Sumi repeated the line hundreds of times, plagued by mosquitoes, while Danpei listened. As dawn approached, the teacher seemed to have fallen asleep. But Sumi, true to his nickname, persisted, repeating the line over and over again. Finally, a voice emerged from the mosquito net, "That's it. You've got it." Danpei had been listening all along, feigning sleep. Such anecdotes are numerous and not limited to Bunraku chanters and puppeteers. Similar stories abound in the world of Ikutaryu Koto and shamisen. Moreover, since their teachers were often blind kenji, known for their stubbornness, it's not surprising that their teaching methods were sometimes harsh and unforgiving. Shunkin's teacher, Haramatsu, was also known for his strictness, and there were instances of students, both blind and sighted, being scolded and even struck, sometimes even tumbling down the stairs from the mezzanine in their panic. Later, when Shunkin herself became a Koto teacher, her severity was legendary, following in the footsteps of her own teacher. This began even in her playing school days with Sasuke, evolving from childish play to something much more serious. While male teachers beating their students was commonplace, it was unusual for a woman to physically punish her male students, as Shunkin did. This raises the question of whether she had a sadistic streak, deriving a perverse pleasure from these punishments. It's difficult to say for certain. But one thing is clear: children often imitate adults when they play. Shunkin, having been favored by her teacher, was never subjected to physical punishment herself. But she had witnessed his methods, and perhaps, in her childish mind, she concluded that this was how a teacher should behave. Her imitation, initially playful, gradually became ingrained, until it became second nature. Was Sasuke a crybaby? He apparently cried every time Shunkin hit him, whimpering pathetically, so that the other servants would roll their eyes and mutter, "Koi-san's at it again." The adults who had initially encouraged the playing school were now having second thoughts. The nightly sounds of the koto and shamisen were bad enough, but now they were punctuated by Shunkin's angry scolding and Sasuke's cries, sometimes lasting until late into the night. The servants would whisper, "Poor Sasuke-don. And it's not good for Koi-san either." Sometimes, a maid, unable to bear it any longer, would intervene, saying, "To San, what are you doing? It's unbecoming of a young lady to treat a boy like this. Please stop." Shunkin would straighten up, her face suddenly serious, and say, "You don't understand. Leave us alone. I'm teaching him seriously, not playing games. I'm doing it for his own good. Don't you understand that scolding and even hitting are part of the training? Don't you know anything about teaching music?" The biography describes this scene, quoting Shunkin, "Do you dare underestimate me, a mere girl, and question the sanctity of the art? Even though I am young, when I teach, I am a teacher. I am not playing a childish game with Sasuke. He loves music, but as an apprentice, he cannot become a proper Kenji. I took pity on him practicing alone, so I, despite my inexperience, have become his teacher, so that he may fulfill his aspirations. This is none of your concern. Leave us at once." The servants, intimidated by her fierce demeanor and eloquent pronouncements, would hastily retreat. This passage vividly captures Shunkin's forceful personality. Although Sasuke cried, he was also deeply grateful for Shunkin's instruction. His tears were not only from pain but also from gratitude for the guidance of the girl he both served and adored. So, no matter how harsh the treatment, he never ran away. He endured it all, crying but persevering until she finally said, "Yoshi, good." Shunkin's moods fluctuated. Sometimes she would scold him relentlessly, which was almost preferable to the times when she would simply frown, silently pluck the shamisen strings, or listen impassively as he played, offering no feedback. Those were the times Sasuke felt most tormented. One evening, she was teaching him the tegoto, instrumental interlude, of Cha Ondu. He was having trouble mastering a difficult passage, making repeated mistakes. Frustrated, she put down her shamisen and began demonstrating the rhythm by slapping her knees and imitating the shamisen sounds with her voice. "Ya chirichirigan, chirichirigan, chirigan chirigan chirigachitan, tun tun zun run, ya ru tun." Finally, she fell silent, leaving Sasuke to figure it out on his own. He couldn't simply give up, so he racked his brains, trying different approaches, but she remained silent, offering no approval. He became increasingly frantic, his body slick with cold sweat, making more and more mistakes. Shunkin remained motionless, her lips pressed tightly together, the frown lines etched deeply into her forehead. This went on for over 2 hours before Shige, Shunkin's mother, came upstairs in her nightclothes and gently separated them, saying that such excessive zeal was detrimental to their health. The next day, Shunkin was summoned by her parents and reprimanded. "Your kindness in teaching Sasuke is commendable," they said, "but it's not appropriate for you to scold and hit him like Kenji-san does. No matter how skilled you are still a student yourself. Such behavior will only lead to arrogance, and arrogance is the enemy of progress in the arts. Moreover, it's unbecoming of a young lady to speak so harshly to a boy, calling him an idiot. Please refrain from such behavior. From now on, you should set a time limit for your lessons and finish before it gets too late. The servants are complaining that they can't sleep because of Sasuke's crying." Shunkin, chastened by this rare rebuke from her usually indulgent parents, appeared to acquiesce. But it was only a pretense. Later, she turned on Sasuke, saying, "You're such a coward. A man crying over such trivial things. Because of your whimpering, they scolded me. If you're serious about music, you should grit your teeth and bear the pain, no matter how much it hurts. If you can't do that, then I'll refuse to teach you." From then on, Sasuke, no matter how much he suffered, never cried out again. Shunkin's parents were growing increasingly concerned. Since losing her sight, she had become not only more willful but, since she had begun teaching Sasuke, also increasingly harsh and demanding. While they were grateful that Sasuke seemed to have a calming influence on her, they worried that his constant acquiescence to her every whim was only reinforcing her difficult behavior. They feared she would become a bitter and twisted woman. Perhaps for this reason, in the winter of Sasuke's 18th year, Yasuzemon arranged for him to become a formal student of Haramatsu, thus putting an end to Shunkin's direct instruction. They likely believed that Shunkin's imitation of her teacher's harsh methods was the root of the problem, and that it was having a negative impact on her character. This decision also sealed Sasuke's fate. He was relieved of his duties as an apprentice and became Shunkin's official guide and fellow student, accompanying her to Haramatsu's house every day. It goes without saying that Sasuke himself desired this arrangement. Yasuzemon must have put considerable effort into persuading Sasuke's parents in the countryside, assuring them that he would take care of their son's future, that he would not abandon him. It's likely that Yasuzemon and his wife were considering Sasuke as a potential husband for Shunkin. Marriage to someone of equal standing would be difficult for their blind daughter, and Sasuke, they reasoned, would be a good match. So, 2 years later, when Shunkin was 16 and Sasuke 20, they broached the subject of marriage. To their surprise, Shunkin flatly refused. She declared that she had no intention of ever marrying, especially not someone like Sasuke. She was deeply offended by the suggestion. A year later, however, Shige noticed something amiss with her daughter. She suspected the worst, and her suspicions were confirmed. When confronted, Shunkin initially denied everything, but the truth could no longer be concealed. She admitted to being pregnant, but refused to reveal the father's identity, claiming they had made a pact of secrecy. Everyone suspected Sasuke, but given Shunkin's vehement denial of any such relationship the previous year, her parents were hesitant to believe it. Besides, such a relationship would be difficult to keep secret. Even the most inexperienced young couple would betray themselves eventually. But since Sasuke had become her fellow student, they no longer spent hours alone together as they had before. Shunkin maintained a distance, treating him as a guide and nothing more. The servants, too, saw no evidence of a romantic relationship. If anything, they thought Shunkin was too cold and distant towards Sasuke, maintaining a strict mistress-servant dynamic. However, when questioned, Sasuke's nervous demeanor aroused suspicion. Pressed further, he burst into tears, saying, "I can't tell you, Koi-san will be angry." "It's admirable that you want to protect Koi-san," Shige said, "but by refusing to answer your master's questions, you are only making things worse for her. Please tell me who the father is." But Sasuke remained silent. However, his evasiveness, his reluctance to explicitly deny the accusation, implied that he was indeed the father. Shunkin's parents were relieved. Well, at least it's Sasuke, they thought. If that's the case, why did she react so strongly last year? They chalked it up to girlish capriciousness, relieved that the situation wasn't worse. They decided to approach Shunkin again, urging her to marry Sasuke, but she remained adamant. "I already told you last year, I have no intention of marrying Sasuke," she said. "I appreciate your concern for me, but even though I am disabled, I would never consider marrying a servant. I am sorry for the father of my child, but I have no intention of marrying him either." When asked who the father was, she refused to answer, saying only, "Please don't ask. I have no intention of marrying him anyway." This contradicted Sasuke's implied confession, leaving her parents bewildered. They couldn't understand what was going on, but they couldn't imagine it being anyone other than Sasuke. They concluded that she was simply being stubborn, and that she would eventually come around. They decided to send her to Arima for a restorative hot springs cure until the child was born. That was in May, when Shunkin was 17. Sasuke remained in Osaka. 2 maids accompanied Shunkin to Arima, where she stayed until October, giving birth to a healthy baby boy. The baby was said to be the spitting image of Sasuke, seemingly confirming everyone's suspicions. Yet, Shunkin still refused to consider marriage, and continued to deny that Sasuke was the father. When confronted with Sasuke, she remained defiant, asking him, "Sasuke-don, did you say something that might lead people to suspect you? I'm the one who will suffer the consequences." She demanded he deny the accusation clearly and unequivocally. Sasuke, intimidated, shrunk back, saying, "Certainly not, Ojo-san. How could I, who has been indebted to your family since childhood, harbor such impudent thoughts? I am innocent." He denied everything so vehemently that it only deepened the mystery. Shunkin's parents tried a different tactic. "Surely you care for your child," they said. If you continue to be so stubborn, we will have to give the baby away. We can't raise a fatherless child. If you refuse to marry Sasuke, we'll have no choice but to find another home for the baby. To their astonishment, Shunkin replied calmly, "Please do as you see fit. A child would only be a burden to me. I intend to live alone." So, the child was given away. He was born in 1845, so he is likely no longer alive. The family he was given to is unknown. Shunkin's parents made the necessary arrangements, and Shunkin, having had her way, continued her life as if nothing had happened, having Sasuke guide her to her music lessons as before. By this time, their relationship was an open secret. Shunkin's parents wanted to formalize the relationship, but since both parties refused, they had no choice but to tolerate the situation. This ambiguous state of affairs continued for a few years. Then, when Shunkin was 20, Haramatsu passed away. She took this opportunity to establish herself as an independent music teacher, moving out of her parents' house and setting up her own establishment on Yodoyabashi Street. Sasuke went with her. Shunkin had likely received Haramatsu's blessing to teach independently before his death. He had given her the art name Shunkin, often performing with her and showcasing her talent. So, it was natural for her to set up her own school after his death. However, given her age and circumstances, there didn't seem to be a pressing need for her to become independent. It was probably a way to resolve the awkwardness of her relationship with Sasuke. Their relationship was already public knowledge, and this arrangement allowed them to live together, at least giving the appearance of propriety. Of course, Sasuke's status didn't change. He remained Shunkin's guide and, with Haramatsu gone, became her student once again, addressing her as Oshisho-sama and being called Sasuke. Shunkin was adamant that their relationship not be perceived as anything other than that of mistress and servant, teacher and student. She insisted on strict adherence to etiquette, dictating every detail of their interactions. Any perceived transgression, even if apologized for profusely, was met with relentless reprimands. As a result, new students were completely unaware of their true relationship. Meanwhile, the servants at the Mozuya house gossiped, saying, "I wonder how Koi-san seduces Sasuke-don. I'd love to eavesdrop. Why did Shunkin treat Sasuke this way?" Even today, in Osaka, family background, wealth, and social standing are important considerations in marriage, perhaps even more so than in Tokyo. Osaka has always been a city where social distinctions are carefully observed. It's not surprising that Shunkin, with her pride as the daughter of an established family, looked down on Sasuke, who came from a family of hereditary servants. Her blindness might have also contributed to her defensiveness, her determination not to appear vulnerable or be taken advantage of. She might have seen marriage to Sasuke as a humiliation. It's important to understand these social dynamics. Shunkin was ashamed of her relationship with a servant, and her aloofness was a way of compensating for this perceived shame. It's likely that she viewed Sasuke as little more than a necessary physical convenience, at least consciously. The biography states, Shunkin was fastidious to an extreme degree. She refused to wear anything even slightly soiled, and her undergarments were changed and laundered daily. She was also meticulous about the cleanliness of her rooms, insisting on them being swept and dusted morning and evening. She would run her fingers over the surfaces of cushions and tatami mats, detecting the slightest speck of dust. Once, a student suffering from a stomach ailment came for a lesson, unaware of his bad breath. Shunkin, as usual, plucked the shamisen strings sharply, then put down her instrument and frowned. The student, not understanding the reason, hesitantly asked her several times. Finally, she said, "I may be blind, but my nose works perfectly well. Go and rinse your mouth." Her blindness might have heightened her sensitivity to cleanliness, but it also placed a considerable burden on those who cared for her. Sasuke, having served her since childhood, was intimately familiar with her habits and preferences. He was indispensable to her. While she still had to defer to her parents and siblings while living in Dosamachi, after setting up her own household, her fastidiousness and willfulness escalated, making Sasuke's life even more demanding. According to Teru Shigesawa, Shunkin never washed her own hands after using the toilet, relying entirely on Sasuke. The same was true for bathing. It's said that women of noble birth would think nothing of having others bathe them, having no sense of shame. Shunkin treated Sasuke with the same casual disregard for modesty. This might have been due to her blindness, but also because she had grown accustomed to being cared for in this way since childhood. She was also extremely fashionable. Although she hadn't looked in a mirror since losing her sight, she was confident in her appearance and meticulous about her clothing and hair ornaments. She likely retained a vivid memory of her appearance at the age of 9, and the constant compliments she received reinforced her belief in her own beauty. She was also obsessed with skincare. She kept nightingales and used their droppings mixed with rice bran as a facial scrub. She prized loofah water, and couldn't bear the feeling of rough skin, dreading any dryness or blemishes. All string instrument players are particular about their fingernails, especially those of the left hand, which press the strings. Shunkin had Sasuke trim and file her nails every 3 days, not just on her left hand, but on both hands and feet. He had to trim them to a precise length, barely a millimeter, and she would run her fingers over them, checking for any unevenness. Sasuke attended to all these needs, while also receiving music lessons, teaching junior students in Shunkin's stead, and managing the household. Physical intimacy can take many forms. Sasuke knew every inch of Shunkin's body, their bond far exceeding that of ordinary couples or lovers. This explains how he was able to care for her so devotedly even after he himself became blind. In his later years, long after Shunkin's death, he often boasted about the smoothness of her skin and the suppleness of her limbs. As mentioned earlier, she was small, but her body was surprisingly voluptuous, her skin exceptionally white, retaining a youthful glow even in her later years. She preferred fish and fowl, especially raw sea bream, and was, for a woman of her time, a gourmand. She also enjoyed sake, reportedly drinking a small cup every evening. Perhaps this contributed to her healthy complexion. Blind people eating can be a pitiful sight, especially a beautiful young woman. Perhaps aware of this, Shunkin avoided eating in front of anyone other than Sasuke. When dining with guests, she would only take a few token bites, maintaining an air of refinement. But in private, she indulged her appetite, though she wasn't a glutton. She would eat 2 small bowls of rice and sample a little from each dish, requiring numerous side dishes and keeping Sasuke busy serving her. It was almost as if she deliberately made things difficult for him. Her hair was abundant, soft as silk floss. Her hands were delicate, yet her fingers, perhaps strengthened by playing the shamisen, were surprisingly strong. A slap from her could be quite painful. She was prone to both overheating and feeling cold. Even in the hottest summer months, she never seemed to perspire, yet her feet were always icy cold. She slept in thick padded silk or crepe nightgowns, the long hem covering her feet completely, yet her sleeping posture was always impeccably neat. She avoided using kotatsu, heated tables, or hot water bottles, fearing they would make her overheat. When she felt cold, Sasuke would warm her feet in his lap, but they were so cold that they often chilled him to the bone. When she bathed, she insisted on having the windows open, even in winter, to avoid the steam. She would take several short dips in lukewarm water, as prolonged immersion would bring on palpitations. She had to wash quickly and get out of the bath as soon as possible. Knowing all this, one can only imagine the extent of Sasuke's devotion and the demands placed upon him. Yet, he received little material reward. His wages were meager, sometimes barely enough for tobacco, and his clothing consisted solely of the garments provided by Shunkin twice a year. He taught in her stead, but was treated no differently from the other servants, addressed as Sasuke-don by the students and maids, and made to wait outside when accompanying her to give lessons. One night, Sasuke was suffering from a severe toothache, his right cheek swollen and throbbing. He tried to hide his pain, occasionally rinsing his mouth to avoid bad breath, while attending to Shunkin. She asked him to massage her shoulders and back, and then to warm her feet. He lay down beside her bed, placing her feet on his chest. His chest was icy, but his face was burning, partly from the heat of the futon, partly from the throbbing pain in his cheek. Unable to bear it any longer, he shifted, pressing his swollen cheek against her foot to cool it. Shunkin immediately recoiled, kicking him away. Sasuke cried out involuntarily and sat up. "I told you to warm my feet with your chest, not your face," she said. "Do you think you can deceive me just because I'm blind?" I knew you had a toothache from your behavior during the day. I can feel the difference in temperature and swelling between your cheeks. If you were in pain, you should have said so. I'm not incapable of compassion for my servants. But to use my body to cool your aching tooth. Such impudence is unforgivable. This was typical of Shunkin's treatment of Sasuke. She particularly disliked it when he was kind or attentive to her female students, suspecting romantic interest. If she sensed any such transgression, while she wouldn't openly express jealousy, she would become even more cruel and vindictive towards him, making his life miserable. Shunkin, being a blind, unmarried woman of independent means, might have been expected to live a relatively simple life, even if she indulged in fine clothes and food. However, her household employed 5 or 6 servants, and her monthly expenses were considerable. The primary reason for this extravagance was her love of birds, especially nightingales. Even today, a nightingale with a particularly beautiful song can cost a small fortune. In those days, it was likely the same. While the methods of training and appreciating nightingales might have differed somewhat from today, the qualities prized were similar. Today, a good nightingale is judged by its taniwatari, valley crossing, song, kekio, 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 its high-pitched hki bekakan song, and its hokeki call. A valuable bird can sing both the taniwatari and hki bekakan songs. Common bush warblers cannot sing these songs, or if they do, their hki bekakan sounds more like hki becha, which is considered crude. To produce the beautiful metallic resonance of bekakan, the birds are trained from a young age. Bush warbler chicks are captured before they develop their tail feathers and placed with a master nightingale to learn its song. Once the tail feathers grow, they are too old to unlearn the songs of their parents. The master nightingales themselves are also trained birds, often given names like H, Phoenix, or Chio no Tomo, friend for 1,000 years. Owners of promising young nightingales would take them to these renowned master birds to learn their songs, a process called ko-otsuke ni-iku, taking them to have their voices trained, often traveling long distances and staying for several days. Sometimes, the master bird would travel to a designated location, and the student birds would gather around it, like a singing class. Naturally, nightingales vary in their talent and the beauty of their songs. Even within the same song type, there are variations in phrasing, resonance, and length of notes. Finding a good nightingale is a difficult and expensive undertaking. Shunkin's prized nightingale was named Tenko, heavenly drum. She would listen to its song every morning and evening, and her mood depended on the quality of its performance. Tenko's song was truly remarkable. Its high-pitched kon note, with its clear resonance, sounded almost like a finely crafted musical instrument. The notes were long and sustained, with a rich timbre. Tenko was treated with the utmost care. Its food was carefully prepared. The standard nightingale food was a mixture of roasted and ground soybeans, brown rice, and rice bran, formed into small pellets, along with a separate preparation of dried and powdered crucian carp or sweet fish. In addition, to improve its voice, they would feed it a special insect found in the stems of a vine called ebidzuru. Shunkin usually kept 5 or 6 nightingales, requiring 1 or 2 servants to be constantly occupied with their care. Nightingales will not sing if they are being watched. Their cages are placed inside wooden boxes called kyoke, with sliding doors that are kept closed, allowing only a soft light to filter through. These boxes are often elaborately decorated with carvings of sandalwood or ebony, or inlaid with mother-of-pearl and lacquer designs. Some are even considered antiques, worth hundreds of yen even today. Tenko's cage was housed in a particularly exquisite box, an imported piece from China, made of rosewood, with inlaid jade panels carved with landscapes and pavilions. It was a truly elegant object. Shunkin kept this box by the window in her room, listening intently to Tenko's song. When Tenko sang beautifully, Shunkin was happy. The servants, therefore, did their best to encourage the bird to sing, regularly sprinkling it with water. Nightingales sing most frequently on clear days, so Shunkin tended to be in a foul mood on cloudy or rainy days. With proper care, nightingales can live for a long time, but they require constant attention. In inexperienced hands, they quickly die. When one died, Shunkin would buy a replacement. The first Tenko died at the age of 8, and it took several years to find a successor worthy of the name. The biography states, the second Tenko's song was also wondrous, surpassing even the mythical Kalavinka bird. Shunkin cherished it deeply, keeping its cage by her side day and night. She often had her students listen to its song, saying, "Listen to Tenko sing." It was once a nameless chick, but through careful training, its voice has become something quite different from that of a wild bird. Some may say that this is an artificial beauty, not a natural one, that nothing can compare to the elegant song of a bush warbler heard unexpectedly in a deep mountain valley, its voice echoing through the mist. But I disagree. The bush warbler's song sounds elegant only when heard in the right time and place. In itself, its song is not truly beautiful. But when I hear Tenko sing, I am transported to a serene mountain valley. I can almost see the clear stream flowing, hear the rustling of the pines, feel the gentle east wind, see the mist on the mountains, smell the plum blossoms, imagine the clouds of cherry blossoms. All these are contained within its song. I forget that I am here, in the midst of the bustling city. This is the power of art, to rival the beauty of nature. This is the secret of music. She would often scold her less talented students, saying, even a small bird understands the secrets of art. Are you, a human being, inferior to a bird? While her reasoning might be sound, it must have been galling for Sasuke and the other students to be constantly compared to a bird. After nightingales, Shunkin's next favorite birds were skylarks. Skylarks have a habit of soaring high into the sky, so their cages are tall and narrow, often 3, 4, or even 5 feet in height. But to truly appreciate a skylark's song, it must be released from its cage to soar as high as it can, its song echoing down from the clouds. This is called kumokiri, cloud cutting. Skylarks will typically return to their cages after a certain amount of time, usually 10 to 30 minutes. The longer they stay aloft, the more valuable they are considered. In skylark competitions, the cages are lined up, and the birds are released simultaneously. The last bird to return is the winner. Inferior skylarks sometimes enter the wrong cage upon their return, or even land some distance away. But most birds recognize their own cages. Skylarks ascend vertically, hover in one spot, and then descend vertically, so they naturally return to their point of origin. Although it's called cloud cutting, the birds don't actually fly horizontally through the clouds. The illusion of cutting through the clouds is created by the clouds drifting past the hovering bird. Neighbors of Shunkin's house on Yodoabashi Street would often see her on the drying platform on fine spring days, releasing her skylarks. Sasuke would always be by her side, along with a maid to handle the cage. At Shunkin's command, the maid would open the cage door. The skylark would burst forth, singing joyfully as it soared into the sky, disappearing into the haze. Shunkin, her blind eyes turned upwards, would listen intently to its song echoing down from the clouds. Sometimes, other skylark enthusiasts would gather with their own birds for informal competitions. On such occasions, neighbors would also climb onto their roofs to listen, some more interested in catching a glimpse of the beautiful blind music teacher than the birds. Even though she was a familiar figure in the neighborhood, young men would rush to their rooftops whenever they heard the skylarks singing, hoping to see her. Perhaps her blindness added to her allure, sparking their curiosity. When she was being guided by Sasuke on her way to give lessons, her expression was usually serious and withdrawn. But when she was with her skylarks, her face would light up with a smile, and she would chat and laugh, her beauty shining through. In addition to skylarks and nightingales, she also kept other birds, Japanese robins, Japanese white-eyes, parrots, sometimes as many as 5 or 6 at a time. The cost of maintaining these birds was substantial. She was what is known as Yukizura no Waru Kata, someone who presents a different face to the outside world. In public, she was charming and gracious, her demeanor elegant and alluring, a stark contrast to the harsh and demanding teacher who tormented Sasuke and her students at home. She also maintained a certain public image, spending lavishly on gifts and ceremonies, befitting the daughter of the Mozuya family, and tipping servants generously. But this doesn't mean she was a spendthrift. In an essay titled Osaka and Osakans as I See Them, the author described how Osakans, despite their apparent love of extravagance, are actually quite frugal, carefully controlling their spending in ways that go unnoticed. Shunkin, raised in a merchant household in Dosamachi, was no exception. Her extravagance was always calculated, serving a specific purpose. She didn't waste money on frivolous things. Her spending was rational and strategic. However, her pride sometimes manifested as greed. She charged her students exorbitant fees, comparable to those of renowned kenji, refusing to lower her prices. She even scrutinized the gifts her students brought, expressing displeasure if they were deemed insufficient. Once, a poor blind student, struggling to pay even his monthly tuition, brought a simple box of hakusenk, white sweet bean jelly, as a mid-year gift, begging Sasuke to intercede on his behalf. Sasuke, taking pity on the student, relayed his plea to Shunkin. She flew into a rage, saying, "Do you think I'm greedy, demanding high fees and gifts? It's not about the money, it's about respect, about maintaining the proper decorum between teacher and student. That student can't even pay his tuition on time, and now he brings a single box of hakusenk as a mid-year gift. Such disrespect. He's treating me with contempt. If he's that poor, he shouldn't be wasting money on music lessons. I'm not saying I wouldn't teach him for free, but that's only for exceptionally talented students, prodigies who are destined for greatness. Those who overcome poverty and hardship to become renowned musicians are exceptional individuals, driven by more than just enthusiasm and diligence. That student is just impudent, with no discernible talent. How dare he ask for my pity? He should give up on music and save himself further embarrassment. If he still wants to learn, there are plenty of other teachers in Osaka. He can go wherever he likes. I'm dismissing him as my student. I refuse to teach him any longer." And she did, despite Sasuke's apologies. On the other hand, if a student brought an extravagant gift, Shunkin would be unusually kind and complimentary, which made the other students uncomfortable. They said that Shunkin's compliments were a bad omen. She would personally inspect every gift, even opening boxes of sweets to examine their contents. She kept meticulous accounts of her income and expenses, having Sasuke use an abacus to tally everything up. She was surprisingly good with numbers, able to perform complex calculations in her head and remember figures from months earlier. Her extravagance, in the end, was entirely self-serving. She lived like a princess, while Sasuke and the other servants were forced to economize drastically, sometimes even going hungry. The servants would grumble, "Oshisho-sama says that her nightingales and skylarks are more loyal than us." Well, no wonder, considering how much better they're treated. While her father was alive, the Mozuya family provided Shunkin with a generous allowance. But after Yasuzemon died and her brother inherited the family business, the money became less readily available. While extravagance among wealthy women is commonplace today, in those days, even men of means, especially those from established merchant families, were expected to live modestly, avoiding ostentation. Yasuzemon's indulgence of Shunkin's extravagance was an act of compassion, recognizing her limited options as a blind woman. But her brother, facing increasing criticism, eventually set a limit on her monthly allowance. This likely contributed to Shunkin's parsimony. However, even the reduced allowance was more than enough to support her, so her music teaching was never a necessity. This explains her haughty attitude towards her students. In fact, she had very few students. This is why she had so much time for her birds. However, even those who resented Shunkin's arrogance acknowledged her exceptional talent as a musician, both on the koto and the shamisen. She was considered one of the best in Osaka. An elderly musician I know, a shamisen player of a different school, told me that he had often heard Shunkin play in his youth, and that he had never heard anyone, even among juta, traditional shamisen music, players, produce such subtle and nuanced sounds. It's also said that Danpei, the renowned shamisen player, once heard Shunkin play when he was young and lamented, "What a pity that such a talent was born a woman and not a man to play the futazao, large shamisen. She would have been a truly great musician." Perhaps he felt that the futazao, considered the pinnacle of shamisen music, required a man's strength and skill to master, or perhaps he found Shunkin's playing style to be unusually masculine. The elderly musician I mentioned earlier said that listening to Shunkin play, one could almost mistake her for a man, her nejime, final note, so sharp and clear. Her tone was not merely beautiful, but also richly varied, sometimes expressing a profound melancholy. She was a truly exceptional musician. If she had been less proud and more willing to compromise, she might have achieved greater fame. But her privileged upbringing, her lack of experience with hardship, and her uncompromising nature alienated many, turning potential admirers into enemies. Her talent, instead of bringing her renown, only served to isolate her. It was a tragedy, though perhaps one of her own making. Those who sought her as a teacher were already convinced of her exceptional skill, believing there was no better teacher. They were prepared to endure any hardship, any scolding or beating, for the sake of learning from her. But even so, few lasted long. Most gave up after a month or two. It's possible that Shunkin's harsh teaching methods, which often crossed the line into cruelty and sadism, were partly a product of her own sense of superiority. Since she believed herself to be a master, and since the world seemed to agree, she felt entitled to behave as she pleased. Her students' expectations only reinforced her arrogance, until she lost all sense of restraint. Toru Shigesawa said, "She didn't have many students, but some came just to admire her beauty, especially the amateurs." This seems plausible. Shunkin was beautiful, unmarried, and wealthy. Her harsh demeanor might have been a way to deter these casual admirers. Ironically, it might have also added to her mystique. It's possible that even some of her serious students were drawn to her more for her beauty and the thrill of being punished by a blind woman than for her musical instruction. Some might have even harbored fantasies reminiscent of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, let us turn to the second calamity that befell Shunkin. The biography is vague on the details, making it impossible to identify the culprit or the precise motive. However, given the circumstances, it's likely that she incurred the wrath of a disgruntled student seeking revenge. There was a young dandy named Ritaro, the son of a wealthy grain merchant, Minoya Kaibei, who lived in Tosaburi. He was known for his profligacy and his love of the arts, and he had become a student of Shunkin's. He was arrogant and entitled, treating his fellow students like servants, which Shunkin found irritating. However, he was a generous gift giver, so she tolerated him. But his behavior became increasingly presumptuous, boasting that Shunkin favored him over the other students and refusing to accept instruction from Sasuke, insisting on being taught by Shunkin herself. Shunkin's patience was wearing thin. Kaibei, Ritaro's father, had built a retirement villa in the quiet district of Tengachaya, with a garden of old plum trees. One year, in February, he held a plum viewing party and invited Shunkin. Ritaro played the role of host, accompanied by geishas and entertainers. Sasuke, of course, accompanied Shunkin. Ritaro and the others repeatedly offered Sasuke sake, which put him in a difficult position. He had become accustomed to drinking small amounts while serving as Shunkin's drinking companion, but he wasn't a heavy drinker, and he was forbidden to drink without Shunkin's permission, especially when he had to guide her. He pretended to drink, emptying most of the sake into a rinsing bowl. Ritaro, however, noticed this and called out, "Oh Shisho-san, why won't you let Sasuke-don drink? It's a plum viewing party. Let him relax for once. Even if he gets drunk, there are plenty of people here who would be happy to guide you." Sasuke, smiling wryly, said, "Well, maybe just a little. But please don't let him drink too much." Ritaro took this as permission and began pouring sake for Sasuke from all sides. Sasuke tried to limit himself, but ended up drinking more than he intended. The geishas and entertainers were fascinated by the renowned music teacher, whispering among themselves about her beauty and elegance. Ritaro, noticing their admiration, encouraged them to compliment her, hoping to win her favor. At 37, Shunkin looked 10 years younger, her complexion remarkably fair, her delicate hands resting demurely in her lap, her blind face tilted slightly downwards, her beauty captivating everyone present. A comical scene ensued when they went out to stroll in the garden. Sasuke, carefully guiding Shunkin between the plum trees, would stop at each one and say, "Here's another plum tree," taking her hand and placing it on the trunk. Blind people rely on their sense of touch, so this was Shunkin's way of appreciating the trees. But the sight of her delicate hand caressing the gnarled old branches prompted one of the entertainers to exclaim, "Oh, how I envy that plum tree." Another entertainer stepped in front of Shunkin, mimicking the tree's pose, and everyone burst out laughing. This was meant to be playful, a way of expressing admiration, not mockery. But Shunkin, unaccustomed to such ribald humor, was displeased. She expected to be treated with respect, and such jokes only served to highlight her disability. Later that evening, as they moved to another room for the banquet, Ritaro told Sasuke-don, you must be tired. I'll take care of Oshisho-san. Go and have a drink. Sasuke, thinking it best to eat something before he was forced to drink more, excused himself and went to another room for dinner. As he was eating, one of the older geishas kept refilling his sake cup, saying, just one more, just one more. He tried to make it last, but he eventually finished. He waited for someone to summon him back to Shunkin, but no one came. Meanwhile, back in the banquet room, Shunkin seemed to be asking for him. Ritaro, however, tried to dissuade her, saying, I'll take care of Oshisho-san. If she needs to use the restroom, I'll accompany her. But Shunkin insisted, waving him away. Just then, Sasuke arrived. He saw Shunkin's agitated state and immediately understood. He was relieved that Ritaro's advances had been rebuffed. However, Ritaro, undeterred, continued to attend her lessons. Shunkin, perhaps annoyed by his persistence, or perhaps simply wanting to assert her authority, decided to teach him a lesson, becoming increasingly strict and demanding. Ritaro, accustomed to flattery, was taken aback. He struggled to keep up, sweating and panting under the pressure. Shunkin's relentless scolding and criticism exposed his lack of true skill. Finally, during one lesson, as he fumbled a passage, she shouted, "Idiot," and struck him with her plectrum, drawing blood from his forehead. Ritaro cried out in pain, wiping the blood from his brow. "Remember this," he said, and stormed out, never to return. Another theory suggests that the culprit was the father of a young girl who was Shunkin's student. The girl, destined to become a geisha, was enduring Shunkin's harsh lessons in the hope of acquiring the necessary skills. One day, Shunkin hit her on the head with her plectrum, leaving a scar near her hairline. The girl ran home crying, and her father, enraged, confronted Shunkin, saying, "I understand that discipline is necessary, but this is going too far. You've scarred my daughter's face. What are you going to do about it?" Shunkin, unrepentant, retorted, "If you knew my teaching methods were so strict, why did you send her to me in the first place?" The father, furious, threatened violence, saying, "I don't care if you hit her, but a blind person's actions can be dangerous. You could seriously injure her. You should know your place as a blind person." Sasuke intervened, calming the man down and sending him away. Shunkin, trembling with rage, remained silent, refusing to apologize. It's been suggested that this father, seeking revenge for his daughter's scarred face, might have been responsible for Shunkin's injury. However, it seems unlikely that a minor scar near the hairline would warrant such drastic retaliation. Moreover, if the intention was simply to disfigure Shunkin, there were more effective ways to do so. Disfiguring a blind person doesn't have the same impact as disfiguring someone who can see. It's more likely that the attacker intended to hurt not only Shunkin, but also Sasuke, by damaging something he cherished. This would be the most effective way to inflict pain on both of them. From this perspective, Ritaro becomes a more likely suspect. While the extent of Ritaro's infatuation with Shunkin is unknown, young men are often drawn to older women, and he might have become obsessed with the beautiful blind musician. His initial interest might have been casual, but being rejected and humiliated, even having his forehead cut open, could have triggered a desire for revenge. However, Shunkin had many enemies, so it's impossible to pinpoint the culprit with certainty. The motive might not have been romantic jealousy. Shunkin's harsh treatment of her students, especially those who couldn't afford her fees, had likely made her many enemies. There was also the matter of Sasuke's ambiguous position in her household. While he officially remained her guide and servant, his true relationship with Shunkin was an open secret among her students, many of whom envied him. They resented his privileged position, his close proximity to the object of their desire. If he had been Shunkin's official husband or lover, their resentment might have been mitigated. But his pretense of being a mere servant, while performing all the duties of a husband, from massage to intimate care, must have seemed hypocritical and infuriating. They might have thought, I could be her devoted servant too, if it meant being that close to her. They might have scoffed at his subservience, secretly hoping for his downfall. Disfiguring Shunkin would be a way to strike at Sasuke, to see how he would react, whether he would remain devoted to her now that her beauty was gone. There is also a more outlandish theory, suggesting that the culprit was not a student, but a rival musician, perhaps a jealous Kenji or a female teacher. While there's no evidence to support this theory, it's not entirely implausible. Shunkin's arrogance and her reputation as the best musician in Osaka must have threatened her rivals. Being deemed inferior to a woman, especially for a Kenji, who held a high social rank and enjoyed certain privileges, must have been a blow to their pride. They might have resorted to underhanded methods to damage her reputation and career. There are stories of musicians poisoning their rivals with mercury out of jealousy. In Shunkin's case, since she was both a vocalist and instrumentalist, and since she was known for her beauty and vanity, the attacker might have chosen to disfigure her, ensuring she could no longer perform in public. If the attacker was a female musician, the motive might have been even stronger, fueled by envy of Shunkin's beauty. In short, there were many possible suspects and motives, making it impossible to determine the truth with certainty. Shunkin, through her arrogance and uncompromising nature, had sown the seeds of her own misfortune, the biography states. A month and a half after the plum viewing party in Tengachaya, on the night of March 30th, around 3:30 a.m., Sasuke was awakened by Shunkin's cries. He rushed from the next room, lit a lamp, and found that someone had forced open the sliding door. Shunkin had been sleeping behind a folding screen. The intruder, realizing that Sasuke had been awakened, fled empty-handed. In their haste, they threw a nearby iron kettle at Shunkin, splashing boiling water on her face, leaving a burn mark on her cheek. It was a minor blemish on an otherwise flawless complexion, and her beauty remained largely unchanged. However, from that day forward, Shunkin became acutely self-conscious about the scar, covering her face with a silk veil and refusing to appear in public. Even close relatives and students were unable to see her face, giving rise to various rumors and speculations. The biography continues. The injury was minor, barely affecting her natural beauty. Her reluctance to be seen was due to her extreme fastidiousness, her shame at this minor blemish, perhaps exaggerated by her blindness. It goes on to say, strangely, a few weeks later, Sasuke developed cataracts and quickly lost his sight. As his vision blurred and darkened, he stumbled into Shunkin's room and cried out joyfully, "Teacher, I have become blind. Now I will never have to see the blemish on your face. This must be the will of heaven." Shunkin, hearing this, remained speechless for a long time. While one can sympathize with Sasuke's devotion, this account seems deliberately misleading. It's hard to believe that Sasuke's blindness was purely coincidental. And while Shunkin was fastidious and perhaps overly sensitive due to her blindness, it seems unlikely that she would react so drastically to a minor burn. The truth is that the attack had a devastating effect on her appearance. According to Toru Shigesawa and other sources, the intruder had entered the kitchen, started a fire, and boiled water in the kettle. They then carried the kettle to Shunkin's room, crept behind the screen, and poured the boiling water directly onto her face. It was a deliberate and malicious act, not a random act of violence by a panicked burglar. Shunkin lost consciousness, and didn't regain it until the following morning. The burns were severe, taking over 2 months to heal. This explains the rumors of her disfigurement, including the claim that she had lost half her hair and was partially bald. While such rumors might be exaggerated, they cannot be dismissed entirely. While Sasuke, having lost his sight, would no longer see the scar, the biographies claim that even close relatives and students were unable to see her face seems unlikely. It would have been impossible for Shunkin to completely isolate herself, and Toru Shigesawa must have seen her face. When I asked her about it, she said, "Sasuke-san always thought of Oshisho-sama as a beautiful woman, so I tried to see her that way too." She refused to elaborate. Years later, after Shunkin's death, Sasuke finally revealed the truth about how he lost his sight. On the night of the attack, he had been sleeping in the next room, as usual. He was awakened by a noise and found that the lamp had been extinguished. He heard Shunkin moaning. He jumped up, lit the lamp, and rushed to her bedside. In the dim light, reflected off the gold leaf screen, he saw the kettle lying on the floor and Shunkin lying motionless in her bed, moaning softly. He thought she was having a nightmare and called out to her, "Oshisho-sama, what's wrong?" He reached out to wake her, but then he recoiled, covering his eyes and crying out. Shunkin, too, seemed to be trying to hide her face, moaning, "Sasuke, Sasuke." Don't look at me. I've been made hideous. Don't worry, Oshisho-sama, Sasuke said, I'm not looking. I've closed my eyes. He moved the lamp away. Shunkin, perhaps relieved, lost consciousness. When she regained consciousness, she kept repeating, don't let anyone see my face. Promise me you'll keep this a secret. She seemed to be delirious. There's no need to worry, Oshisho-sama, Sasuke reassured her. Once the burns heal, you'll be back to your old self. But Shunkin refused to be comforted. How can my face remain unchanged after such severe burns? She cried. Don't try to deceive me. Just promise me you won't look. As she recovered, her insistence only grew stronger. She refused to let anyone see her face, not even Sasuke, except for the doctor, and even then, everyone else was banished from the room while her bandages were being changed. Sasuke had caught a glimpse of her burned face that night, but it had been too brief, too horrifying to fully register. He had immediately turned away, the image seared into his memory as a fleeting, monstrous apparition. After that, he had only seen her face partially covered by bandages, her nose and mouth exposed. Just as Shunkin feared being seen, Sasuke feared seeing. He deliberately avoided looking at her, averting his gaze whenever he approached her bedside. He didn't know the extent of her injuries, and he didn't want to know. As Shunkin's wounds began to heal, and the time came to remove the bandages, she called Sasuke to her room one morning. Sasuke, she said, you saw my face that night, didn't you? No, Oshisho-sama, he replied, you told me not to look, and I obeyed. But soon the bandages will come off, she said, and you will see me. I can't hide my face from you forever. There was a tremor in her voice, a rare display of vulnerability. She began to cry, pressing her hands against her bandaged eyes. Sasuke, speechless, wept with her. Don't worry, Oshisho-sama, he said, I promise I won't look. His voice held a strange conviction. A few days later, when Shunkin was well enough to be out of bed, Sasuke took a mirror and a sewing needle from the maid's room. He sat on his bed, looked at himself in the mirror, and plunged the needle into his left eye. He hadn't known for certain that this would blind him, but he had heard stories. He wanted a quick and painless way to become blind. He aimed for the pupil, but it was difficult. The white of his eye was too hard, but the pupil was soft. He jabbed it several times, and the needle went in, sinking deep into his eye. He felt a strange detachment, a sense of unreality. He saw the world turn white, his vision clouding over. There was no blood, no pain, no fever. He repeated the process with his right eye. He had blinded himself. At first, he could still perceive vague shapes, but within a few days, he was completely blind. When Shunkin emerged from her room, Sasuke went to her, his hands outstretched. Oshisho-sama, he said, I am blind now. I will never see your face. He bowed his head before her. Sasuke, she said, is that true? She fell silent, lost in thought. Sasuke had never felt such joy, such profound peace. The legendary warrior Akashichibi Kagekyo, moved by compassion for his enemy Yoritomo, had gouged out his own eyes, vowing never to look upon Yoritomo's face again. While Sasuke's motive was different, his act was no less dramatic. Is that true, Sasuke? Shunkin repeated. Her voice was barely a whisper. To Sasuke, those few words sounded like the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He felt a surge of emotion, a profound connection to Shunkin that transcended words. In that shared silence, in the darkness that now enveloped them both, a new kind of intimacy was born. He remembered the darkness of the closet where he had practiced the shamisen as a boy, but this was different. Most blind people retain a sense of light and direction, their world not completely dark. But Sasuke's world was now truly dark, and in that darkness, he felt closer to Shunkin than ever before. He could no longer see her, but he felt her presence more acutely than ever, as if a new inner eye had opened. He saw not with his eyes, but with his heart. He had entered Shunkin's world. Does it hurt, Sasuke? Shunkin asked. No, Oshisho-sama, he replied. It's nothing compared to what you've endured. I feel ashamed that I was sleeping soundly while you were being attacked. It was my duty to protect you, and I failed. I prayed to the gods to punish me, to make me share your suffering. I prayed every day, begging for a misfortune to befall me, so that I could atone for my negligence. And now my prayers have been answered. I am blind, just like you. This must be the will of heaven. O Shisho-sama, please don't worry. I will continue to serve you as before. I can no longer see your changed face, but in my mind's eye, I see only the beautiful face I've known for so many years. Please allow me to continue caring for you. I know I'll be clumsy and slow now, but I promise I'll do my best. I don't want anyone else attending to your needs. He turned his blind eyes towards the faint glow that indicated Shunkin's presence, a faint white halo in the darkness. Sasuke, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, thank you. I don't know who attacked me, or why, but I couldn't bear the thought of you seeing my scarred face. You understood my feelings. Thank you. O Shisho-sama, Sasuke said, your words mean more to me than my sight. Whoever attacked you, wanting to cause you pain, to make you and me suffer, they have failed. I can no longer see your scar, so their wicked scheme has come to nothing. I am not unhappy. I am happier than I have ever been. I feel as if I have triumphed over them, avenged you. The blind teacher and her blind disciple embraced and wept. The person who knew most about their lives after this transformative event was Toru Shigesawa. Toru, now 71, had entered Shunkin's household as a live-in student at the age of 12, in 1874. While studying music with Sasuke, she also served as an intermediary between the two blind musicians, a role that went beyond that of a mere guide. One was newly blind, the other blind since childhood, and both were accustomed to a life of luxury and dependence. They needed someone to assist them with even the most basic tasks. Shunkin had initially wanted to hire a young girl for this role, someone she could easily control. But after Toru arrived, she proved to be so capable and trustworthy that she remained in their service for many years, eventually caring for Sasuke after Shunkin's death, until he received the title of Kenji in 1890. When Toru first arrived, Shunkin was 46, 9 years after the attack, already a middle-aged woman. She always kept her face covered with a silk veil, and Toru was forbidden to look at it. Shunkin would sit on thick cushions, wrapped in a patterned silk robe, her head covered with a dark grey silk veil that concealed everything but a portion of her nose, the edges draped over her eyelids, hiding her cheeks and mouth. Sasuke, who had blinded himself at 41, must have found his new blindness extremely challenging. Yet, he devoted himself to Shunkin's care, anticipating her every need, determined to shield her from any discomfort. Shunkin, for her part, refused to be attended by anyone else, insisting that only Sasuke, with his intimate knowledge of her habits and preferences, could properly care for her. She relied on him for everything: dressing, bathing, massage, even using the toilet. Toru's main task was to assist Sasuke, rather than Shunkin directly. She rarely touched Shunkin, except to help her with meals. Otherwise, she simply fetched and carried things, indirectly supporting Sasuke's efforts. For example, when Shunkin bathed, Toru would accompany them to the bathroom door and wait outside until Sasuke clapped his hands, signaling that they were finished. Sasuke would handle everything inside the bathroom, washing and dressing Shunkin. It's hard to imagine how a blind man could wash another blind person, but presumably, Sasuke, like Shunkin exploring the plum tree with her fingertips, used his sense of touch to guide him. It must have been a laborious and time-consuming process. Everything they did was complicated and awkward, requiring immense patience and coordination. It seemed almost unbearable to watch, yet they seemed to find a certain pleasure in these shared rituals, their unspoken love expressed through these small acts of service. The depth of intimacy experienced by two blind lovers, their connection forged through touch, is beyond the comprehension of those who can see. This explains their unwavering devotion, their tireless patience with each other. Sasuke, while caring for Shunkin, also taught music. Shunkin, confined to her room, would spend her days listening to her nightingales, occasionally calling out for Sasuke when she needed something. Even during lessons, if Shunkin called, Sasuke would immediately drop everything and rush to her side. He was always attuned to her needs, refusing to travel to give lessons, teaching only at home. It's important to note that by this time, the Mozuya family business in Dosamachi was in decline, and Shunkin's allowance had become irregular. If not for this, Sasuke would have had no need to teach music. He would have devoted himself entirely to Shunkin's care, and both of them would have been spared much hardship. Why didn't Sasuke marry Shunkin, even after he became blind? Was it still Shunkin's pride that prevented it? According to Teru, Shunkin had softened considerably in her later years, and was likely willing to marry him. But Sasuke couldn't bear the thought of Shunkin as a pitiful, diminished figure. He couldn't see her as anything other than the proud, beautiful woman he had always known. He had blinded himself precisely to preserve that image, to avoid seeing her scarred face. His blindness was not a misfortune, but a liberation. It allowed him to live in a world of memory, a world where Shunkin's beauty remained unchanged. He had created an idealized image of Shunkin, and he couldn't bear to have that image shattered by reality. So, he chose to remain her servant, her disciple, her protector, not her husband. He continued to address her with the utmost respect, denying himself any claim to equality. He dedicated himself to her care, accepting his meager wages and simple food and clothing, using all his earnings to provide for her needs. He reduced the number of servants and economized wherever possible, but he spared no expense when it came to Shunkin's comfort and happiness. His blindness had only deepened his devotion, making his service even more demanding. According to Teru, the other students, pitying Sasuke's threadbare clothes, urged him to spend more on himself, but he ignored them. He even forbade them from addressing him as Oshisho-sama, teacher, insisting they call him Sasuke-san. This embarrassed them, and they avoided addressing him directly whenever possible. Only Teru, due to her role as intermediary, continued to call him Sasuke-san, while addressing Shunkin as Oshisho-sama. After Shunkin's death, Sasuke confided in Teru, sharing his memories of his beloved teacher. He told her, "People think that blindness is a misfortune, but I have never felt that way. Since losing my sight, I feel as if I've entered paradise. It's as if Oshisho-sama and I are living together on a lotus flower. When you lose your sight, you begin to see things you couldn't see before. I truly saw Oshisho-sama's beauty only after I became blind. I felt her touch, the smoothness of her skin, the beauty of her voice, more intensely than ever before. And her music. I finally understood her genius, the depth and subtlety of her playing, after I lost my sight. It's a shame I didn't appreciate it sooner. If the gods offered to restore my sight, I would refuse. Our blindness brought us a happiness that those who can see can never know." While Sasuke's account is subjective, it suggests that Shunkin's musical talent might have actually deepened after the attack. While she had always been gifted, true artistic mastery often requires experiencing hardship and adversity. Shunkin, having been raised in luxury, had never known true suffering or humiliation. The attack, while tragic, had also been a crucible, shattering her arrogance and forcing her to confront her own vulnerability. It had deepened her understanding of life, and perhaps, of art. Teru often heard Shunkin playing alone in her room, Sasuke sitting beside her, listening intently. The other students, hearing the exquisite music emanating from her room, would whisper among themselves, wondering if Shunkin had somehow tampered with her instrument to produce such extraordinary sounds. It was during this time that Shunkin began composing her own music, experimenting with different melodies and rhythms late at night. Teru remembers two of her pieces, Shun no Uden, Spring Nightingale's Song, and Rika no Hana, Six Flowers. I recently had the opportunity to hear them, and they are remarkable works, revealing Shunkin's creative genius. In early June of 1886, Shunkin fell ill. A few days earlier, she and Sasuke had gone down to the courtyard and released their beloved Skylark. Teru watched as the two blind musicians stood hand in hand, their faces turned upwards, listening to the Skylark's song fading into the distance. The bird soared higher and higher, disappearing into the clouds, and didn't return. They waited anxiously for over an hour, but the Skylark never came back. Shunkin seemed disheartened by this, and soon after, she became ill with beriberi. Her condition worsened in the autumn, and on October 14, she died of heart failure. She had also been keeping a third tenko, which survived her. Sasuke mourned her deeply, weeping whenever he heard tenko sing. He would often burn incense at her altar, playing her favorite pieces on the koto and shamisen, especially Shun no Uden, which was considered her masterpiece, a piece into which she had poured her heart and soul. It's a short piece with a complex instrumental interlude, inspired by the Song of Tenko. The melody evokes a series of images: the melting snow in the mountains, the murmuring stream, the rustling pines, the gentle east wind, the mist on the mountains, the scent of plum blossoms, the clouds of cherry blossoms, capturing the spirit of the nightingale flitting from branch to branch, valley to valley. When Shunkin played this piece during her lifetime, Tenko would respond, its song echoing the melody, as if competing with the shamisen. Perhaps the music reminded Tenko of its native valley, of the vastness of the sky and the warmth of the sun. And what of Sasuke? Where did his mind wander as he played Shun no Uden? Having learned to see Shunkin through touch, did he now rely on sound to conjure her image? As long as we retain our memories, we can see our loved ones in our dreams. But for Sasuke, who had seen Shunkin only in his mind's eye, the moment of their separation might have been less clearly defined. Shunkin and Sasuke had 3 other children, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter died shortly after birth. The 2 sons were given away to farming families in Kawachi while they were still infants. After Shunkin's death, Sasuke made no attempt to retrieve them, and they showed no desire to return to their blind father. Thus, Sasuke lived out his remaining years alone, cared for by his students, until his death on October 14, 1907, the anniversary of Shunkin's death, at the age of 83. During those 21 years of solitude, he likely created an even more idealized image of Shunkin, a vision far removed from the reality of her scarred face and demanding nature. The story of Sasuke blinding himself was heard by the priest Gaisen of Tenriji Temple, who praised it as an act of profound Zen insight, a transformation of ugliness into beauty, a feat worthy of a true master. Does the reader agree? June 1933.